welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thanks for joining me. If you just come across my channel for the first time, I release content all about crime on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. So if you like crime and consistency, then this is the channel for you. And yes, I am sat here shamelessly plugging my merch. I am Bang to Rights, one of my favourite sayings in the world, now delivered to you in various t-shirts, soon to be hoodies, mugs, and whatever else. In fact, whatever sayings that I say will probably come out in some merch at some point. But it's cool, isn't it? Bang to Rights, bitches. So, that's a little bit offensive, Emma. Don't know where I was going with that. Think I thought I was a cool young person for a minute. Bit embarrassing. Bit embarrassing. Let's forget that never happened. Right. Thank you again to all my Patreon followers. Very much appreciate you. You're allowing me to create better content and concentrate more on it, which is amazing. As I say, everybody counts here. Your views, your comments, your likes. So if you do like this content, please pop your notifications on and subscribe so that you can know when I release my next content. Also, just a shout out to the previous video that I did. You might not have seen it if you're new to the channel, but on Arthur Labinjo Hughes. Just wanted to say a massive thank you to all of you for your comments and care about that child. Wow. I mean, I listen to all your comments and I take on board what you say, and I appreciate it when you get invested. But sometimes just to see the compassion and passion that people feel about justice is mind-blowingly wonderful. And I just wanted to acknowledge, because I know a lot of you come to my live chats. Yes, for those of you who've never been here before, I tend to be on the live chats. I do premieres. So on a Wednesday and a Sunday, I release the content and I'm there and we all have a good natter. It's really supportive. Communicate. It's a communicate. What's a communicate, Emma? Well, it's a community with cake. It's a communicate. That's going to be a merch suit. That's a joke, it's not going to be. But the point is, everyone's really lovely there, really supportive space, and we all get to know each other, which is awesome. But you were all really invested at that point. I was reading your comments and just feeling your pain, and I think that we did Arthur proud. And also, just a shout out to those of you seeing it later, and again, so many heartwarming comments, and I feel like that little boy will not be forgotten by any of us. We often remember the murderers' names. I want to forget the murderer's name in this case. I want to remember that little boy, Arthur Labinjo Hughes. So let's just shout out and connect over the fact that we all really cared about that particular individual. Moving on, I'm going to start today's case, which again is one you probably won't have heard of. God, I hope you haven't heard of it, because you guys drive me mad. I've been presenting TV crime shows for nearly 14 years and maybe doing some really exciting ones soon that are my own, but that's totally separate news. And the reality is that you tend to know the cases even when I go for the really obscure ones. So today I'm hoping that you don't know this case, but I bet somebody's going to be like, know it, I studied it, I did a master's thesis on it. And if that's the case, I apologise. I am trying to find ones that you won't have heard of, but you know, shout out if you have, because it's always interesting to me to see the information being shared about these kind of cases. So today I'm going to be covering the case of Jonathan Dew. So Jonathan was 42 years old when he was murdered. He was from Batley, West Yorkshire. I'm sure some of you are from that area. It's only about 51 miles away from where I live, so it's quite local to me. And he was a really highly vulnerable man. And when I say vulnerable, I mean holistically vulnerable, both from a learning, an emotional, a psychological, and a social context. So a really vulnerable individual. And the description that people would give him was that he didn't have a bad bone in his body, which is one of those sayings that these days I hear more rarely. But you know what it means when somebody says that. It expresses that kind of human being that's unassuming, humbling, really kind, and would literally give you the coat off their back if you're having a bad day. And that embodies this particular individual. And the problem is that Jonathan was vulnerable in a way that made him incredibly trusting of people. And I think when you think of cases like Gemma Hayter, for example, another individual who had quite severe vulnerabilities, so it's a different level of vulnerability that we're talking about. Nonetheless, there was that same connection of trusting people, so investing very quickly in individuals who seemed to be nice. And I think we all can do that. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us have invited partners into our lives that we deeply regret and are like, I should not have trusted them. It's the natural state in human experience to go through your life making micro-trust decisions. We micro-trust that when we do the toast, we're not going to get electrocuted by the toaster. We micro-trust that when we take our children to school, we're not going to get killed on the way. We micro-trust the world constantly, right? And so that's the way we survive. It's how we make connections with people. It's how we build relationships. It's how we basically get through our day-to-day life, because there are micro-trust experiences. But most of us have got boundaries. And those boundaries are, if somebody starts to act outside the realms of acceptable behaviour, we are quick to deny them entry into our world. And that's a really important part of what keeps us safe in life. But if we haven't got those boundaries, or they're not as fixed or as rigid to some degree, I'm not saying really rigid boundaries are good, they're not. But I'm saying, some quite tight boundaries around our expectations of other people, then unfortunately we can become incredibly vulnerable to predators. The problem with Jonathan, not that it was a problem, it's not him that's the issue, but the problem as far as the way that people could use him was that he thought everyone was his friend. And that of course causes a lot of problems, because the world is not full of people who are our friends. For everybody listening to this now, you probably, like me, you can count your real friends on less than 5 fingers. Is it just me? Everyone's sat at home right now going, Emma is incredibly lonely. Emma needs to socialise and get out more. Emma needs more friends. You guys are my friends. I have a lot of cyber friends who I love dearly. I feel like I know you. But genuinely, in my day-to-day life, I don't have a lot of time, and I certainly don't want to trust people that I don't know well enough with the intricacies of my world, so I keep my world small. And if you have like 1,000 friends, it means that the access to you is so open, and it means that you don't necessarily know the people as you should to call them real friends, and you certainly wouldn't want to invite anybody into your life, and this is what he did. Also worth noting that, as I said, he did have some social and psychological emotional issues that led to long-standing issues with drug abuse. And he wasn't addicted to smoking weed. Some people would say you can't be addicted to smoking weed, but let's say you can. Let's just go with that you have an issue with requiring weed all the time because you have anxiety or depression, you feel that's useful to you, and so on and so forth, and you don't feel you can survive without it. But we're talking about class A drugs. And class A, we're looking at heroin. And for anybody who doesn't understand what it's like to be a heroin dependent, I think that heroin is probably one of the most challenging drugs to overcome. If you have Disney Plus, I would strongly recommend you watch Dopesick, because it talks about the OxyContin crimes that Purdue Pharmaceuticals carried out on our society, making ordinary human beings with very moderate pain completely addicted to opioids. In fact, just to put this out there, guys, this is a crime channel, so we may as well talk about crimes against humanity. And one of the biggest crimes is that in the States, double the amount of people died of opioid addiction during the COVID crisis as they did of COVID. But of course, trust pharmaceutical companies. After all, they're only killing lots of people with things like that. And I know there are great pharmaceutical companies and there are great pharmaceutical drugs, but I'm just saying, where there's profit, there's problems. And so the reason that I'm bringing it up is that OxyContin is basically an opioid, and heroin is an opioid, but one that you get off the street, nonetheless, equally as devastatingly addictive. And class A drugs are obviously class A because we know that they have immeasurable harm on the human being that takes them. So Jonathan had acknowledged that he had a real problem with these class A drugs, and he'd been prescribed methadone. And methadone equally has lots of problems with respect, but at least it's on a program and you're being dealt with by picking it up by a pharmacist or going to a particular drugs unit to take your methadone. Then hopefully you're going to be managed off it over periods of time. And even though some people stay on methadone for many, many years, the chances are that that will reduce the opportunities for you to offend, because what we know about heroin dependency is unless you are incredibly lucky and you have the wealth to not worry about spending money, for the average human being, you burn through your cash to a point where you have to do things that you would never have considered doing pre-addiction to feed your addiction. And that's why we see a lot of sex workers on the streets who have horrific heroin dependency issues. It's exactly the same as why we see so many homeless people or shoplifters and so on and so forth trying to support their habit. They look like they're the scourge of society at times, but they're not. They're dependent individuals with a horrible affliction and very little support around them, often from backgrounds that have been quite problematic as well. Lecture over. Just saying. He had a big issue with those drugs. So because of this, around July 2019, Jonathan basically moves into a terraced property on Brighton Street in Wakefield. And that is run by a project for the homeless, essentially. They're there to provide support to vulnerable people, get them back on their feet. A little bit like a halfway house, so to speak, to help individuals who maybe have fell off the radar employment-wise and housing-wise to get back into a position where they're eligible for benefits and they can start accessing work. And of course, most importantly, they can find a safe place to stay and essentially move forward to get their own accommodation. You know, that's the way these programs work. Now, of course, this is fantastic. We want people to be placed in situations where they can heal. And that is the whole premise of dealing with addiction. You want them to go through a program, get the support that's required, receive an ongoing foundational package that gets them back on their feet, and then ideally move them to new positions which are full of hope. That's the ideal scenario. And it would be wrong of me to not note that one of the biggest problems that we have when it comes down to things like heroin in particular is the addiction rate regarding returning to that addiction is stupendously large. It's incredibly difficult to get off it, and many individuals who've tried very, very hard to do so fall back into addiction. And one of the reasons for that is when you're sent to a place where there are other vulnerable people, they can often have habits themselves that trigger yours. So it's not always ideal, even when you're getting a safe roof over your head, to be sent to a place where there are other individuals who are struggling. I think we can all agree with that. So Jonathan goes to this property and there are two other guys living there. That's 21-year-old Nathan Redmond and 24-year-old Jordan Metcalfe. Worth noting at this point that Metcalfe had a really big history of violent offences. So this is a violent guy. And for those of you who have ever studied psychopathy and look at the prison population, when you look at the prison population per se, you've got about 8% of people in prison who are psychopathic, as in they would be classified psychopaths. But when you look at the violent population within the offending group, it's 31%. That's a large population of very violent people who are also psychopathic. So it's interesting to know that even though we might not be aware that this guy is a psychopath, he has a very big history of violent offences, which certainly means that he has a dangerous temperament. Also, both those guys had previous issues with substance abuse. So it is a bit of a problem sending an individual with such vulnerabilities to a place like this, because obviously it can activate that latent substance addiction issue. And it does seem that that property did have a bit of a reputation in the local area. It was considered a place where antisocial behaviour happened regularly. One of the big problems was it attracted drug users. And as we know, again, we've got drug users, or at least users with prior history of being dependents, meant to be living there safely and being looked after so they can get back on their feet. So it's not ideal if drug users are coming to that place, because again, that's going to provoke or trigger other people's behaviour when they're trying to get clean. And these individuals would literally be seen shouting up at the windows at all hours, to the point where police were attending residents regularly, so they were constantly being called out to them. Now, another guy that would turn up at the house regularly was 24-year-old Scott Crutchley. He was a regular visitor to the address. He rented a room at the nearby Black Swan Hotel on Westgate, Wakefield, and he was later described in court as having a very weak character. So he was somebody that was considered quite easily led. He would follow others because he wanted to be part of a crowd. He didn't want to stand out. He didn't want to get himself in trouble as far as falling out with the actual individuals he was hanging out with. So whatever they were doing, good or bad, he would tend to follow. Now, as I was saying, one of the guys who lived there was Metcalfe. And it took him a second within meeting Jonathan to realise that he was incredibly vulnerable. And that attracted him to Jonathan, not because he was like, I need to look after this guy. This guy seems to be somebody who has some vulnerabilities, some fragilities, and maybe need to protect him, keep him safe. Quite the contrary. It was a classic psychopathic realization, as far as I'm concerned. He looked at Jonathan and he thought, I can exploit this guy. I can exploit this individual. And even though he was his housemate, that was what he decided he was going to do. He was going to exploit him and the situation to the fullest. And it started immediately. There was no build up to this. There was no escalation. There was no kind of petty manipulation that started to grow over the months and years. This was a fully fledged attack on Jonathan's vulnerabilities. And remember, Jonathan is meant to be in a safe space where he's being protected, cared for, and helped back onto his feet. This is the absolute opposite of what should be happening in a scenario like this. It shouldn't be a position where Metcalfe has the potential to take any kind of manipulative control over Jonathan, because people should have their eyes on this situation. The first thing he starts to do, you won't be surprised, he starts to exploit him financially. So he uses his bank account, and he uses his bank account not to just drain it, so to speak, but to actually use it for fraud. So he basically starts using it for money laundering. So he's got him involved in this online fraud scheme, which is something that Jonathan hasn't got a clue about, is too vulnerable to understand, and it demonstrates the level of control that Metcalfe immediately exerts over him. On the 5th of September 2019, this ill treatment that's been growing goes from financial exploitation and control of coercion over him to physical abuse. So remember, Jonathan is incredibly trusting. He's just going along with what he thinks his friends want him to do, because remember, he believes that people who hang out with him are his friends. He's not being discerning over their natures. He just imagines that if they're there with him, they must like him. And that's probably the only thing that Jonathan is guilty of, that he's got this incredibly trusting nature. And that's why he has literally no idea the danger that he's in. So on this day, the 5th of September 2019, Jonathan, Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond spend the day drinking. And they're also taking cocaine together in pubs in Wakefield city centre. Bear in mind that they're meant to be at a place where these kind of behaviours are getting challenged and where they're moving forward in their lives. So we can see immediately that this is not a group of individuals that are trying to change, and this is certainly a group of individuals who are feeding each other's negative habits. Jonathan at this point thinks he's with friends, he's having a good time. You know, he's hanging out with a group of people, he's having fun. And even though it's going against his sobriety that he's meant to be trying to achieve, nonetheless, he's doing something that, as far as he's concerned, gives him a sense of belongingness and connectedness. We all know what that feels like. You know, when you're hanging out with people and you think, this is my group of friends. I can trust them, I can have fun with them, and you get excited about those possibilities. I'm sure that that was where Jonathan was in that moment. But on the early hours of the 6th of September, 4 men returned to the property on Brighton Street after they've been drinking and taking drugs all through the day and night. So imagine where they are mindset-wise. High as kites, very drunk, and remember what that does to our psychology. I often said on this channel, and I would say anywhere, that when people say that people tell the truth when they're drunk, etc., or act how they really mean when they're drunk, I don't believe that. I've seen people act reprehensibly when they're drunk or on drugs, but actually every other behaviour that I've ever seen of that person has been great, but they've done something, they've created this mix, and it's brought out the very worst in who they are, and it's changed their behaviour for the better because they've realised that that is not something they want to be. And that would usually be the chain of consequence that we'd experience, but it isn't the case for these guys. When they get high and drunk, they are a very dangerous mix, but they don't learn from their errors, they don't learn from their behaviours. In fact, it just provokes them to do more and more and more. So they arrive back, and now we're in quite a dangerous situation, because remember, we've got people with violent predispositions, we've got easily led people, we've got individuals who don't want to challenge the status quo and just go with the crowd, which is a heady mix of possibility and potential. Now, at some point during the night, Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond basically turn really violent. And we're talking about from pretty much 0 to 100 in a short amount of time. Metcalfe suggests that what they need to do as a group is they need to kill Jonathan. I mean, where the hell does that come from? The idea that this innocent, friendly, vulnerable human being who's been hanging out with them all day is now somebody who's a problem. And the way that Metcalfe wraps this up is he says, listen, we've got to kill him because smackheads always talk. So the reason he's using that is because obviously we know that Jonathan's got an issue with dependency of Class A's, but it's because, of course, Jonathan has been coerced into giving Metcalfe his financial details so that he can use it to launder money for fraud, right? So now, as a consequence for Jonathan allowing Metcalfe to use and abuse in this way, he's going to be killed. Imagine the leap that we're talking about there. I mean, you're afraid that somebody might break your confidence, so the next level to that is, well, we'll kill them. And again, the reason I'm bringing that in is because to me, that says that what's running through Metcalfe's veins is a high level of malicious sadism. Because for the most part, you might threaten somebody that you're afraid may speak to somebody else about what you've been up to. But to go and gravitate towards murdering and to escalate to such a point where the consequences of doing it would be far more serious than if you were caught for online fraud, because that's what we're talking about here. At the very worst, you might get a short prison sentence, whereas murder, you're looking at a much longer one. So it doesn't connect, it doesn't synergize. This isn't about Metcalfe wanting to kill Jonathan because he believes he's a threat. This is because Metcalfe wants to kill Jonathan for the thrill. Simple as that, because it doesn't add up, his reasoning behind it. So it's clear that as far as Metcalfe is concerned, he's got this perfect motive, right? But also in Redmond, he's got the perfect violent accomplice who's going to be able to carry out the killing with him. And it symbolises and signals the start of a 2.5 hours of drink and drug-fueled brutal violence and brutal torture. And remember, this is going from a position where they were out drinking and taking drugs earlier on. So this is complete blindsiding for Jonathan. He's got no idea of why this would occur. As far as he's concerned, he's on the same side as these guys. Now, the initial attack begins in Jonathan's bedroom, and it seems that this is Redmond who initiates it. And just trying to put yourself in the position of where Jonathan would have been at this moment in time. He'd be completely stunned that this was occurring. He'd probably initially be thinking that this is just a bit of a laugh, you know, that there's no way anything terrible is going to happen. These are his friends, right? Redmond ties Jonathan's hands together with bootlaces and also ties around his neck with them. And it's like he starts to try and strangle him, but it doesn't work out. So he keeps strangling him numerous times. And CCTV footage from the house opposite actually captures parts of the attack, which is ironic because these guys think behind closed doors nobody can see, right? Well, they can, because they're not very bright, are they? And they won't realise that the house across the road has got the cameras on their house as well, because obviously it's a problem house. So they're going to be pointing in the direction of the problems, which means that we have footage of the attack. Like I said, bang to rights. Classic example of bang to rights, because literally they're getting recorded. So Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond are shown continually entering and leaving Jonathan's room. And this is over the course of like several hours. And they can actually see as well, in spite of the fact they haven't got absolute crisp, clear footage of the individual perpetrators, what they can see are silhouettes. And they can see these silhouettes of figures attacking someone and then attempting to clear up afterwards. So literally in and out, like a rebound, just going in, attacking, leaving, returning, attacking. 3:30 a.m, Jonathan's last seen on CCTV footage, and he's running into his bedroom, followed by Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond. And Redmond is actually seen dragging Jonathan to the other side of the room. The attack that he experienced was brutal, it was prolonged, it was agonising. So they repeatedly punched him and kicked him. They stamped on his back, they stamped on his torso. He actually suffered multiple broken ribs, which, as you'll know, makes it difficult to breathe and is incredibly painful. And also they used so much force on him that trainer prints were left on his back. They also stabbed him about his head, his neck and his body. And he had slash wounds, quite a few, over his body. They'd hacked off a part of his ear. This is a group of men just violently aggressing this completely innocent, very vulnerable individual who had no idea of why this was happening. I mean, that's something we all have to just take a moment to recognise. Jonathan had not provoked any of them. He had been complicit in all of his behaviours around them. He'd been complicit in the relationships that he had with them. You know, he wasn't antagonistic, he wasn't conflictual. He'd gone ahead and handed over his bank details so he could be financially used. This was a very, very complicit individual. He was not trying to get into any altercations with these people. It's as simple as that. And just to put it in context, the sound of the assault that was going on toward Jonathan was so loud that the neighbours were woken up during the incident. And those neighbours, they described hearing noises like, quote, someone being thrown against a wall, and the sound of someone being strangled or suffocated, and they heard screams over a considerable amount of time. There's a bit of me that's like, okay, at what point do we make that call? At what point do we think, well, I can hear somebody being suffocated, I can hear somebody being thrown against a wall, I can hear somebody screaming. Maybe I should pick up the phone and dial 999. I know that sounds a bit judgy, guys, but we've not learned anything, it seems, from what happened to Kitty Genovese. She was an individual who was murdered outside of her apartments. Loads of people heard it happening, and basically no one called emergency services till way too late. And the consequence of that was that she was horrifically murdered and stabbed numerous times on numerous occasions after the perpetrator followed her several times. It was horrific. We should have learned from these kind of crimes, but it doesn't seem like we have a great deal. But nonetheless, at this point, no one summons help. And I suppose we could say, well, maybe it was because the place that they were staying was constantly having people turn up and scream and shout outside the windows, and the reputation that that particular place had was negative. People didn't want to get involved, and people were just experiencing this idea that it was just one of those things. There was regular disturbances there, it's probably just another one. But sadly, that's why nothing happened, and that's why Jonathan didn't get the help that he so badly deserved at a point that he needed it. Now, at some point during this horrific attack, the location of the assault changes, and Jonathan's dragged out onto the landing where the attack obviously continues. Now, during this assault, Metcalfe and Crutchley actually leave the property, and whilst they're gone, Redmond continues to attack Jonathan. So there's no letting up. There is an enjoyment here, isn't there? That two can actually leave and one remains, and instead of kind of taking a step back and thinking, God, what's happening? Instead of coming to the senses, which is something that to some degree we'd have expected, that in the cold light of day, when the other people involved in this vicious attack have removed themselves from the circumstance and you're left by yourself, because you haven't got that pack mentality, you haven't got the permission of the other people, often there'd be a cooling off and a recognition of what the hell am I doing, and maybe even an opportunity for you to leave, to remove yourself, vacate that experience, that place, because you want to avoid any further issues, because you're realizing how heinous your actions have become and how dangerous this situation has become for you on a criminal level. And that's not what happens. Redmond is enjoying this. He wants to carry on harming Jonathan. And the fact that the other two have left and then return and are not interested in helping Jonathan, in fact, they just want to carry on, that in itself demonstrates that they've had time to come to their senses and they didn't. Simple as that. They had time in the cold, fresh air to go for a walk, have a conversation, talk about how out of hand things have got, and to get the hell away. But they don't. They come back. At this point, Jonathan is absolutely, catastrophically and horrifically injured. They basically walk him to him lying unconscious at the top of the stairs. Redmond is sat next to him eating a pot noodle. Just put yourself in that position. There's a guy catastrophically injured. You're responsible for doing it. You have had time to go and make yourself a pot noodle. Who thinks, oh, you know what? I'm a bit peckish. During a massive assault. And this says a lot of things about him, doesn't it? He's cool, he's calm, he's collected because he's been able to stop, remove himself, make food, return, sit and eat the food next to a very badly beaten, catastrophically injured Jonathan. And that's devoid of feeling, isn't it? There's no empathy there. There's no aversion. There's no repulsion. For most of us, if we came across somebody who was horribly injured, we probably would struggle to eat for a few days because we'd be so averse to what we'd seen that our stomach would turn. You're not going to feel peckish immediately after seeing something like that, are you? So we can see the psychology of Redmond is very concerning in this moment. The fact that he can sit there after subjecting Jonathan to such a horrific attack and eat is utterly terrifying. And at one point, Redmond actually uses his phone to make a video call to a former girlfriend. And I think we can all give her a round of applause that she was a former girlfriend, making her a good judge of character. And she actually noticed, whilst he was on the call, that he had blood on his knuckles. So he isn't even trying to hide this. He's just not concerned at all. He's got his pot noodle. He's got his ex on video call. He's got blood all over his hands. Doesn't bother him in the slightest. And if it's not bad enough to imagine that scene, you would think, okay, well, it's calm now. They've had time to reflect. Pause. Jonathan's in a horrible way. Walk away. Because they've had this lowering of their activity that's been violent. Therefore, time to reconsider and to just let go of some of that adrenaline and cortisol that's built up when they've been attacking him. But no, absolutely not. They're not finished with him. So they finally drag Jonathan's battered, broken, bruised body into the cellar. This guy at this point is so defenseless, it's unbelievable. He hasn't got the power, he hasn't got the defensiveness, he hasn't got the capacity to defend himself in any way whatsoever. In fact, he is in absolute urgent need of medical attention. So what they do is they lie him down and then they throw bricks at him. And I don't mean like a few bricks, not that that would be in any way, shape or form excusable, it's horrific. But I'm talking about throwing bricks at him for a significant, protracted amount of time, like being stoned in other countries. You know, where a woman commits adultery and the way that they deal with that is to stone her, because that seems like a completely acceptable form of behaviour, doesn't it? That isn't barbaric and backwards. And yes, I did say that. Barbaric and backwards. Feel free to make a meme of it. I don't care. It's true. It's barbaric and backwards. It's as simple as that. But essentially, that's what they do. They throw bricks at him. Jonathan was actually conscious for periods of this, which is terrifying. I mean, this guy is completely disorientated, horrifically injured, completely blindsided, shocked by what he thought were his friends viciously attacking him. And he's aware that they're doing this during that period of time. So for some periods of that time, when he's having these bricks thrown at his head, he's absolutely conscious. Also, they repeatedly strike him about the face, around his head, around his body. He had so many injuries to his skull. He had injuries to his facial bone, he had injuries to his jaw, and it actually resulted in a brain injury that at some point did manage to render him unconscious, which to some degree was merciful release, because my God, the agony he must have been in would have been absolutely impossible to imagine. They also decided that they wanted to cut his throat. So they tried to cut his throat with a razor blade. And when they found it difficult to open up the wound, they went and got a spoon and they forced the spoon into the wound to try to move it around to speed up his death. That in itself is one of the most harrowing images that I have in my mind. Think about the pain that Jonathan is already in, and the fact that they're trying to slit his throat and then open the wound with a spoon. The bloodlust of that, the way that they were okay with something that so many of us would feel unbelievably like it was playing out in a gruesome horror film and would make us want to run a mile, and certainly would make most of us want to call for help. And there they are, just doing that to him. Now, I've got to say at this point, Crutchley wasn't actually as actively involved in the attack as the other two, but he did go along with it. You know, he didn't make any attempt to stop it. Also, he made a really pathetic, which was later described as cack-handed, attempt to clear up the evidence from the crime scene. So like I said, even though he wasn't very actively involved with the violence, he was present. He could have stopped it. I know he'd have been scared, but he had an option. You always have an option. And he chose to go along with this gruesome, barbaric murder, and then he tried to help them clean up. So he is absolutely complicit here. He is an accessory to murder. Those final series of attacks in the cellar, they proved fatal. And when they did the post-mortem, they were able to establish that basically Jonathan died from head and neck injuries, but they identified over 90 injuries to his body. He must have suffered such a slow and agonising death. Remember, it was protracted over like several hours, and he was conscious for most of that. So he would have been in writhing agony all that period of time. Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond obviously don't want to get caught. So they think, okay, how do we conceal this crime? And they think, we know, this is an absolute fail-safe method. We'll set the house on fire. That's what we'll do. We'll set the house on fire. What could possibly go wrong? What could go wrong? Can it go wrong? No. He'll burn to a cinder. We'll be scot-free. Yes, I'm sure that would happen. You've been watching a lot of very bad B-grade horror movies, haven't you? This isn't how it works out, but okay, let's go with it. So they're like, right, okay, let's set fire to this property. So they get a fire started in the cellar. They set alight paper, textbooks. I imagine they weren't their textbooks. I can't imagine they were studying very hard, but somebody's textbooks. I don't know whose textbooks, but textbooks did get set on fire and some other materials. And the only thing I'm going to say at this point is there's one small mercy when they're doing this. Jonathan's dead. So at least he wasn't completely incapacitated, and then they set fire to the basement and he ends up getting horrifically burned. I mean, that would be even worse than what we've talked about so far. So he's dead by this point. But they start this rudimentary fire, and then they realise, look, we're going to have to leave Wakefield because essentially we've carried out this heinous murder, and the likelihood is that someone's going to realise that we are the people responsible for them. But again, the psychology of this is bizarre. Because on one level, we're seeing them try to cover up the murder. They're setting fire to the place that they're meant to reside in. And on the other hand, they're paying £100 to get a taxi from Wakefield to Scarborough so they can flee. Now, it doesn't take a detective more than around 3 seconds to go, where are the guys who lived with him? They've got a taxi to Wakefield after the house set on fire with a dead person in it. I mean, these guys are not sophisticated, are they? But they've decided that they need to make their escape. Now, you will not be surprised that our diligent trio of very sophisticated criminals have completely screwed up as far as the fire is concerned. Now, as many of you will know, fire often doesn't properly take hold. So when people try to create an arson situation, very often it doesn't burn the entire place down. Sometimes it burns out, and essentially it's also one of the things that draws a great deal of attention. So the consequence of this was it hadn't taken hold properly, and the neighbours heard the fire alarm from the house. They call emergency services around 6 a.m. I have to say, this really annoys me. I mean, the minute they hear a fire alarm, they call emergency services. But they didn't call the police earlier when they heard somebody screaming and being thrown against a door and horrible noises coming from the home. So it doesn't make sense to me that people would react to what they think could be a fire, but not to what they think could be a murder. I mean, Jonathan's screams could literally be heard down the street. Now, the firefighters arrive, start looking around, and immediately they find Jonathan's body in the cellar. When they were looking, because obviously it's been a fire, it hasn't taken hold, but there's soot and it's black and it's very scary when you look at fire scenes. When the fire officers go in, the firemen are looking around. Very often they have to use imaging goggles because of the fact that they cannot see anything, particularly when it's in the cellar anyway, and it's covered in soot. So they use this thermal imaging equipment and they manage to locate his body, and he's declared dead by the paramedics at 6:23 a.m. So it's immediate that they've realised he's dead. So the very fact that they arrived on the scene just after 6 a.m. and then by 6:23 they've not only found Jonathan, they've declared him dead, means that it would have been an instant recognition that there was nothing they could do for him. So the police are called, immediately launch a murder investigation, and they described Jonathan's bedroom as a scene from a massacre. That was how it was described, a scene from a massacre. So I think we can all go to in our minds what that would have looked like. We're talking about a horrific, torturous scene that to the naked eye was able to tell the story of what had gone on. That it was so catastrophically covered in blood, it was everywhere, that whoever had fallen that evening was somebody who had had a protracted experience of torture bestowed on them. Now, the same day at 11:25 p.m, Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond have forged the most incredible escape plan, one that is shocking for a group of individuals who surprisingly can't really do very much with their lives normally, and yet somehow manage to completely outsmart the police for a very long period of time. No, they don't, not at all. 11:25 p.m. the same day, they're all arrested in Scarborough. Yeah, they were trying to hide in a pile of wooden sleepers at the end of the pier. I know. They're a clever bunch of cons, aren't they, these guys? I'm not sure why they thought that hiding in a pile of wooden sleepers at the end of a pier was going to outsmart the cops. But basically, they're brought in bang to rights immediately. All three charged with Jonathan's murder straight away. And when the police bring them in, well, they start interviewing them, and you will be unsurprised to know that they all staunchly defend each other and acknowledge their parts in the crimes, taking full risk. No, they just blame each other. That's what happens. They just blame each other for Jonathan's death. It's standard, isn't it? We're all good mates until we're arrested, and then I want you to go to prison and I want to walk free. And they turn on each other. Now, what I would say is during the first interview that Redmond is involved in, he does accept responsibility for killing Jonathan. He says he bound him, he gagged him. He even admits to dragging Jonathan into the cellar, to cutting his throat with a razor blade. He also says that he threw a bucket of house bricks at his head. However, in his second interview, he then retracts his earlier comments. And there's that little bit of me, isn't there, that's like, did he have any advice in the first interview where he's like, I've been caught, it's pretty obvious what we did, may as well just admit it, accept the sentence, right? And then he got some legal representation and they were like, when you say you admitted everything, are you sure you admitted everything? I admitted everything. Did you admit the bricks? Yes, I did. Did you admit the spoon and the razor? Yes, I did. You shouldn't have admitted any of it because now essentially you're guilty. It's all right, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, none of it happened. And I imagine his legal counsel was like, yeah, it's not going to work. But anyway, second interview, retracts all the comments, now blames Crutchley and Metcalfe entirely. So he claims Metcalfe basically uses a spoon to inflict the injuries to Jonathan's throat, and he says it's because he wasn't dying quickly enough, so that basically Metcalfe has used his spoon to end his life more quickly. But remember, who sits with detectives and explains exactly what happens, putting themselves as the individual who's carried out the murder and then pretends it's somebody else. It doesn't work that way. Unless you happen to be in a liaison with somebody you're madly in love with and you're just going to take the fall for them, which in this case, it wasn't how it played out. So the detectives are definitely not buying it. Now, on the 9th of September 2019, this is when all three of the guys who were involved with this murder appear at Leeds Magistrates Court. All of them plead not guilty to killing Jonathan. Not guilty. Guilty? Of course we're not guilty. Weren't you seen on CCTV carrying out the murder? Well, I mean, they said we were, but they were just silhouettes. Didn't you just get a cab from where you were in Wakefield to Scarborough to escape? Just wanted to go to the beach for a day out. Why were you hiding at the bottom of the pier? We like hide and seek. So they went not guilty. I don't know who's advising them. I don't think this is a good idea. You're going to get a more lenient sentence if you admit to the crime. Judges do not like people who do not admit what they did. Simple as that. And juries do like people who talk a load of bubbles about their behaviour when the evidence clearly shows what they were guilty of. It makes their job a great deal easier. Unsurprisingly, when they pled not guilty, the judge wasn't like, oh, okay, you can have bail because you probably will be fine. He was like, you're all getting remanded into custody. So the court case occurs, trials at Leeds Crown Court. At this point, Metcalfe chooses not to take the stand at all during the trial. Doesn't surprise me in any way, shape or form. I imagine that if Metcalfe got up there, it may be possible, shall we say, to make him look as bad as he really is. So prosecutor Simon Keeley QC at this point claims that all three defendants were responsible for Jonathan's death, although he also acknowledges that some had been more directly involved than others. And he said, quote, each of these defendants played a part in the killing by attacking Jonathan Dewes themselves, but also by assisting the others in the attack. During that trial, not one of the three defendants showed any remorse, not one. I have a real problem with that. I have a real problem with people who cannot express remorse genuinely. I appreciate that some people, when they're in a court case, can go numb and be in shock, but I still feel that even if you're numb and in shock, when it gets to acknowledging the part that you played in the crime, just acknowledging that you're sorry for what you did is a very human response. And if you don't do that, I think that your humanity is at question. I think your level of empathy and potential for compassion is certainly something we can question. And none of them seem to be sorry at all. Also, during the court case, they consistently lie. They constantly try to blame each other. It's a very immature position, so it's childish. As opposed to thinking about how they can defend their own position and make sense of their actions and take responsibility and accountability for them, they deflect. It's a constant, you did this, I didn't do that. And they're trying to do that to pin the blame on another so that they can walk free. But it's a poor way of doing it, because clearly all of their stories are going to be about blaming the others. Therefore, each of their stories are undermined by the others, which makes them equally culpable in this moment in time, because they're looking at that evidence and seeing that these individuals are merely trying to deflect blame so that they can somehow pin a bigger crime on the other people involved, but actually it just highlights their guilt further. Not taking responsibility for any individual roles in this killing meant that, of course, the jury and the judge are going to be exploring this as these are selfish characters who cannot potentially be rehabilitated at this moment in time because they literally won't accept what they did. And remember, when you think about restorative justice, when you think about being restored to your position in society, you know, to actually go through the prison system and acknowledge what you did and the impact, it's essential before you're allowed out, because we want to know that people who do these horrific things can learn from their horrific mistakes. So 20th of February 2020 was a 4-week trial actually. So it went on a fair while for these guys. Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond are all found, say it with me, guilty of murder. Of course they are. They were always going to be found guilty of murder. So then we have the sentencing. 21st of February, Mr. Justice J sentenced the 3 men to jail terms totaling 75 years. I know that for people in America in particular, that will seem like nothing. But in the UK, that is still considered a relatively hefty sentence. And what the judge said, quote, was, "This was brutal, vicious, explosive and mindless violence." So very, very clear that this was not about any kind of defence position. This was completely brutal and completely unnecessary force. There were serious aggravating factors in this case. Serious. So when the judge is looking at giving the sentence, he's exploring what was going on in the lives of the individuals carrying out the crime, but also in Jonathan's life. So the aggravating factors were that Jonathan was highly vulnerable. He was a drug addict. He was in supported accommodation. The nature of the killing was massively prolonged. So the suffering that Jonathan went through, the torture he experienced was huge. Also, the perpetrators tried to conceal the crime. They started a fire to destroy the evidence. They also left Wakefield, and then they deflected by blaming each other, which shows a complete lack of remorse as well. So they are big aggravating factors. So Redmond was given a life sentence with a minimum of 27 years. And the judge said this: "You, Nathan Redmond, described Jonathan Dew's bedroom without overstatement as a massacre scene. You also agreed that an external observer would say that Jonathan Dew was being tortured. An insight into your state of mind may be derived from the fact that you were eating a pot noodle at the top of the stairs when the others returned, sitting next to the unconscious and grievously injured Jonathan Dew. In my opinion, you have shown no remorse throughout this trial." I think we can all agree that is an excellent summing up of Redmond's position. Metcalfe was also sentenced to life with minimum of 27 years, and the judge stated here, "You have a bad record for crimes of violence, although for nothing remotely as serious as the offence for which I'm concerned. You may not have initiated these assaults, but once they started, you were an entirely willing participant. I can see that you are a strong-willed individual who does as he pleases." So again, very clearly saying, listen, I might not see a history of what you've done that resonates with the violence you've bestowed on this poor man, but I can see you're not somebody who can be driven. You've made choices that you wanted to make, and you wanted to make these choices, so he came down very hard on him too. Now Crutchley, remember what we talked about earlier on, very easily led. Well, he is given a life sentence with a minimum of 21 years, so still a very, very strong sentence. And the judge stated, "What you did that night was wholly out of character. My assessment of you is that you're a somewhat weak personality who is easily led. I'm not sure that you were directly involved in the violence inflicted on Jonathan Dew after he was dragged out of the bedroom. However, and as I have said, you availed the others in the knowledge and with the intention that they would kill Jonathan Dew." So you can again see that this judge is not having the wool pulled over his eyes. He recognises that yes, this individual was less responsible for the direct murder of Jonathan, but he was absolutely culpable in that killing. And of course, what happens in the legal system in the UK is you have to show that for somebody who's been involved lesser within the crime, that there are less years affiliated with that. So that's why he gets that lesser sentence. The judge also stated it must have been an absolutely terrifying, protracted death. The case, in fact, left the court emotionally numb. That's how it was described, emotionally numb. And that even after 4 weeks of the trial, the judge said that they were not able to comprehend what triggered the killing. You know, they looked at the evidence, they listened to the perpetrators, they tried to figure out what on earth had happened to go from being on a day and night out with apparently a group of friends to suddenly torturing and murdering an innocent, vulnerable man. It felt like, as far as the trial was concerned, they just could not unearth a reason. It just seemed not only completely unprovoked, but without any form of escalation whatsoever. And that is highly unusual in these cases. Now, after the trial, Senior Investigating Officer Detective Superintendent Nicola Breyer stated, Jonathan Hughes was subjected to a horrific and sustained attack by people he thought were his friends, people he thought he could trust. Jonathan's family, they released a statement too. And they said, today we have got justice for Jonathan. Words cannot describe the torment of losing him in such horrific, brutal circumstances. The pain and suffering he endured throughout that night will haunt us forever. And I think that everybody watching this right now, we connect with that, don't we? Jonathan was somebody's child, was somebody's family. When you work with families of individuals who've been murdered, you see the ripple effect of that loss, and it is ever growing. There are birthdays they will never celebrate. There are Christmases they will never experience. There are children that will be born that will never know them. There is pain that is everlasting. There are memories that will never be formed, but that will always also haunt those that love him. That's what happens in murder. And it can literally destroy entire families, loving families who are just blown apart because of the loss of somebody that they loved. I think when we look at this case psychologically, we have to ask ourselves, what was it that made them make that horrific choice to violently torture and abuse this poor man? I think that one of the things that they managed to do was to dehumanize him a little bit. And I'm saying that because when you look in the system of prison, what you'll see is that there are different levels to a prisoner. So let's say that at the top of the chain is a gangland drug dealer who dealt firearms and is very much top dog. And they're valued by other prisoners because they tend to be people that everyone thinks, well, they probably have killed people, but they're probably people who deserve it. So there's a just killing to it. They've usually had quite a lot of money, so they feel quite enamored by this relationship that they have with these top dogs, to the fact that they often have great links with the outside world and can get things into prison and so on and so forth. So they're like top of the chain. And then you kind of go down, and we know that the very bottom of the chain, of course, is child murderers and paedophiles. But kind of just around there or a little bit above are people who are heroin dependents. And it's even the same with dealing on streets. So there is a gradient in the way that drug dealers are seen. If you're a dealer of cocaine and ket and E and weed even, you're kind of considered, an individual of a certain amount of respect in the community. If you're a smack dealer, you are literally somebody who is likely to get run out of town by those other dealers. It's seen as a really dirty drug, and people are therefore associated with it, are also considered that way. It's not true, but because of the way that people act when they're on smack, when they're on heroin, it does make them act in ways that many other people don't respect. And instead of seeing them as a human with problems, they judge them very harshly. So Jonathan is somebody that potentially has been dehumanized by his addiction to heroin. And therefore, because he's a, inverted commas, a smackhead, they don't need to offer him the same level of respect and care as another kind of human being. And that's what gives them the in to carry out that horrible behavior. This is just me making assumptions, and certainly from my experience of working with individuals who have addiction problems, I certainly see that the viewpoint towards individuals with heroin addiction is different to those with, shall we say, cocaine addiction or alcohol addiction even. They went out of their way to exploit a highly vulnerable person. He was a drug addict in supported accommodation. They took full advantage of him, particularly from the get-go, where it was using his finances to commit fraud. He had this trusting nature which made him the perfect victim. They got away with using his bank account for illegal purposes, and they then gave themselves the reasoning and excuse, because they were untrustworthy, to imagine that because he was a smackhead, he was going to be more untrustworthy than them, and therefore it was reasonable and right to kill him. His life had absolutely no value in their eyes. And that, I think, is very much bolstered, my viewpoint, by the lack of remorse that they showed in court. And also, The lack of compassion per se they offered Jonathan during that assault, and of course no assault is compassionate, I'm saying as they went ahead and bestowed this horrific attack, there were moments where they could have stopped, where one could have intervened, one could have said no more, and they didn't give him any of that. They enjoyed it. They really enjoyed inflicting that violence on Jonathan. Redmond in particular, let's be honest. He's sat eating a frigging pot noodle when this guy, this apparent friend, is literally dying by him. I also want to make it clear that I do think that Crutchley did just go along with it. But that makes him complicit and culpable and reprehensible, because it's the people in life that just go along with things that are the cancer in so many situations. Because an individual can act reprehensibly and we can call them to account, we can stop their behaviour, we can challenge them, we can bring them to justice and so on and so forth. But if you just go along with it, if you just accept it, then you give permission to those individuals to continue and you stand on the side of evil. And I think that a lot of us can relate to that right now. There are many sayings about all it takes for evil to rise is for good people to stand around and do nothing. And certainly for me, that's a saying that rings very true currently in our society politically, and certainly in circumstances like this, we can see the damage and danger of just going along with something. Now, the latest data on UK homicide rates, well, it's not good, guys. It's not good. It really isn't. So in the last 3 years, a third of homicide victims were under the influence of alcohol or illicit drugs at the time of their death. 19% had been drinking alcohol, 7% had been taking an illicit drug, and 7% were actually under the influence of both, like Jonathan was. Almost a third, so 30% of homicide victims were known to be drug users like Jonathan. And when you look at figures for murder suspects, well, it's similar. So people who are actually committing the crimes, who are killing those people, it's a similar statistic. So almost a third, 31% in fact, of homicide suspects were under the influence of alcohol and or drugs at the time of the homicide. 16% had been drinking alcohol, 4% had been taking an illicit drug, and 10% were under the influence of both. And that's like Crutchley, Metcalfe and Redmond in this case. A massive 43% of homicide suspects were known to be drug users, as in this case. 43% were known to be drug users, as is this case. But still, pretty much nothing is being done about the contributing factors towards drug addiction. So let's think about that. The things that contribute towards drug addiction are things like poverty, cuts to youth services, domestic violence, education. All of these things contribute if there is a lack of or an appearance of within those individuals' lives. And yet, all we see is a rise in poverty. All we see is a rise in cuts to youth services. We see domestic violence rising massively, and we see education failing many, many young people from the wrong postcodes born to the wrong parents. These opportunities to catch individuals before they fall is not sufficient. In fact, I would argue most of the time it doesn't even exist, that there is a catch net there. There is an estimated 306,000 heroin and or crack users in England. Around 200,000 of those are in treatment in any 1 year. And just to put this in context when we talk about the UK, because I think that we've got some very false ideas about what a great place this is to live, I really do. And actually this applies to other Western states, just to put it out there, but homicide rates have been falling around the world. They have been falling, and guess what? They have been rising in England and Wales since 2015. Yeah, fully developed country, apparently, the land of opportunity, land of the free, though not for much longer if the government have their way, but nonetheless, it's been going up since 2015. And one of the reasons for this is the attitude that the government have towards particular populations. So historically, the government was always losing the war on drugs. Simple as that. This war on drugs, it's the same in the States actually. Let's have a war on drugs, which means a war on people with respect. It's people who take drugs. It's not the drugs knocking on the door saying, take me. It's what people want to do for a whole range of reasons, and not because they're bad or not because they're criminal, because they're self-medicating their pain on the whole. They're self-medicating the horrible lives they've led on the whole. And yes, some people from other environments who shouldn't apparently end up on drugs because, I don't know, they had wealthy parents. That happens too. But nonetheless, pain is the issue on the whole. So the government have been losing the war on drugs, both here and in the States, which are two of the places that use that term, monumentally since they decided to say they had a war on drugs. Their approach has been very clear: to enforce the prohibition of drugs through the criminalisation of drug use, possession and supply. And for their efforts, the supply and use of drugs has increased. Well done on your war. It seems to have done the opposite of what you wanted, and you're losing. But why should we change tack? I mean, we have the evidence that says what we're doing is absolutely useless, and it's just criminalising individuals who need to be helped, and that actually that costs society a huge amount more and results in lots of people dying that don't need to. And what we should do there is continue the war on drugs. Let's continue a course of action that doesn't work. Gosh, the government are at least consistent. They do seem to continue courses of action that have absolutely no impact and just cause massive issues for society. Why change a thing, eh? This has created a massive illicit market, and this illicit market of drug use and abuse, it contributes to violence, it amplifies conflicts, and it absolutely breeds corruption. And I'm just going to bring in Portugal at this point. Because in Portugal, the use and possession of all drugs, they were decriminalised in 2001. So since 2001, all drugs are decriminalised. Since then, drug use has remained below the EU average. In fact, not only has they seen the drug use issues in Portugal remain below the EU average, they've also seen major increases in the number of people accessing treatment. If that's not enough to make you go, do we need to rethink our strategy? There's been a huge drop in drug-related HIV transmission. And from 1999 to 2008, the number of people incarcerated in Portugal for drug offences fell 44%. Because when you don't treat drug users like criminals, when you treat them like humans, amazing things happen. This idea that being punitive psychologically has the impact that we want is just a myth. Tough love actually doesn't work. People need soft places to fall. Anyway, in spite of all of this, why would we follow? No, the UK government isn't following Portugal's example, and in fact it's now considering a 10-year strategy that could see, and believe me guys, listen up. The government's considering a 10-year strategy that could see recreational drug users lose their passports or driving licenses. Now some of you might think, well, you know, they're taking drugs. Okay, well, if you drink alcohol, you've lost your argument. If you take caffeine, you've probably lost your argument as well, because when you look at things like cannabis, that actually in tests seems to make people safer drivers because they're a little bit paranoid. But let's not tell that story either, because that doesn't suit the narrative in the UK. I'm not being pro drugs, certainly not behind the wheel. Believe me, I've never even got in a car after having a glass of wine. I am paranoid beyond belief about anything being in my system, but I am saying if it doesn't make sense, it tends to be nonsense. And it certainly seems the war on drugs is nonsense in the UK. And the idea of people who might recreationally take a drug and get caught with a tiny, tiny microgram, and to put it in context, if you drink a glass of wine, that makes you a lot more dangerous than having a microgram of cannabis in your system. But if you make it so that that 10-year strategy is going to affect anyone with anything in their system, then you take their passport off them because they're not allowed to be free anymore. They're a prisoner in their own country, which again is becoming something that I think a lot of us feel anyway. Nonetheless, it's infringing on so many human rights without thinking about what is going on for those individuals who are taking drugs. So most people are taking them for a bit of fun. It doesn't get out of hand. It's not going to be a problem. Live and let live. But for those who are really struggling, making their lives more difficult is not the way forward, believe me. These measures have fortunately been criticised by a lot of people, but they're just going ahead with it. As far as I'm concerned, the UK is going backwards. We're targeting lifestyle users of Class A drugs with tough criminal sanctions. Now, such war on drugs era criminal sanction-led approaches is in stark contrast to other countries. So many more progressive. They use approaches such as the legalisation of cannabis in Canada, because the tough on drugs narrative just hasn't worked in the past. You know, the saying, if all you ever do is what you've always done, then all you're going to get is what you've always got. Amen. And that's what's happening. So it's time we changed. The illicit drug market in the UK is worth 9.4 billion a year. The cost to society is more than double that in terms of health, crime, societal impacts, so double it. And it's really sad that a life of a drug addict in the UK seems to hold less value than other lives. You know, despite the most horrific nature of this guy's death, you know, Jonathan was murdered in a reprehensible way. There is a tiny amount of detail in the media. Believe me, it's almost impossible to find pictures of these guys. It's really difficult to find any in-depth news reports. You have to go to the court to understand what played out. As far as society is concerned, with respect, and I know that you guys don't believe this, but a lot of people think it was just the death of another smackhead, to use that term. And because of that, it just didn't generate the usual media frenzy. So Jonathan's life, one that if it had been, let's say, a white middle-class woman who had been brutally murdered in this way, and the consequence was that it came out, it would be everywhere, and rightfully so. But it feels like when somebody who's a heroin dependent gets murdered, people just aren't as interested as they should be. Jonathan was a guy who was related to other human beings who loved him dearly. He had his problems, he had his struggles, but he was kind and generous and invited the wrong people into his world. That was all he was guilty of. And the reality is we need to listen more closely to these individuals who are already in a position where they have lost more than most. So as opposed to ignoring their stories, as opposed to ignoring what happened to them, we have to be aware that these individuals need more compassion, more care. And if we don't offer it, then more and more of these cases will go under the radar, much like they do when it's a sex worker and people are like, well, she only got raped and murdered because she put herself in that position. It's like, no. This is the only thing that matters. A life was stolen by murdering people who had no right to take that life per se. And the more that we take notice of these cases, the more that we recognise the kind of crazy plans the government have for individuals who are already suffering enough, the more that we notice policies that aren't working and lobby the government to hold them to account to prevent further immeasurable damage, then the better our society will be. Like I said, I've done this case because Jonathan's life mattered. He was a drug dependent. He was still worthy of making the news in a way that he should have. I hope that you found it an interesting case. I wanted to concentrate a little bit on the law and also drug dependency and homicide because I think that those statistics matter as well. And like I said, this is about recognising that people with drug dependency issues are people of meaning, no matter what the media tell us and no matter what our pop culture and ideas around what heroin users in particular are like tell us. Thanks for joining me. Let me know what you thought. If you found it interesting today, please get your subscription notice on. Give me a like, give me a comment. I read them all. Join me for a live chat. Join me in wearing my merch. I do like this. I'm liking it. My wardrobe's ever expanding. Pete in the end will just be working for me, just making me new t-shirts. They'll just be me. I just have loads of t-shirts. I'll have a t-shirt for every day of the week, every day of the year maybe. Take care guys. Join me again soon and keep safe. Bye.